Chapter 10. They try to get even for Cornwallis. STS-51, Secret Training School 51, was a parachutist instruction setup situated on the outskirts of Altrincham, a small town 80-odd miles northwest of London, chosen because of its proximity to Ringway, the regular British airborne school. The instructional branch of the British Intelligence Service ran 51, and OSS special bodies took their shoot training in seclusion at this school. The actual jumps were made at Tatton Park, a network of fields adjacent to Ringway. Even the OSS officers and men who were graduates of the U.S. Army Parachute School at Fort Benning had to take the course at 51. The great majority of special body drops were made after dark, and since the British had the night flying rights over the continent, the operations were usually flown in their bombers, and the jumps were made British style. This meant going out through a hole in the bottom of the plane's fuselage. At Benning, it was simply a matter of stepping through a door in the side. I made the trip to Alfgram, accompanied by 11 others, none of whom I had ever seen before. We were met at the station by 51's chief instructor, Captain Peter Leghorn, a rather nonchalant gentleman whose black beret indicated previous service in the Tank Corps. He seemed pleasant enough, but his attitude towards American military personnel in general, and OSS personnel in particularly, usually bordered on "they also serve." A bus took us through the village and out to the school, a lovely old estate, complete with lawns, gardens, a small lake with 2 swans swimming around looking meaner than hell. Even a peahen in the driveway. Langhorne volunteered the information that the school's peacock, bloody thing was the pride of the organization, had departed for bliss eternal a few days previous after colliding head-on with a well-kicked but badly aimed soccer ball. The commanding officer was waiting to greet us on the front steps. He was a gruff old colonel called back to active duty from the retired list, and quite content to leave the actual running of the school up to his chief instructor. After a short speech of welcome, he turned us back over to Leghorn, who saw to it that we were fed a hot supper, shown the way to the nearest pub, and told to be back by midnight. I accepted his invitation to stay in the officers' lounge and learn the intricacies of snooker pool. Talk around the table centered mainly on the week to come. I was amazed by the time involved, or lack of it. My opponent as much as accused me of trying to throw him off his game with a barrage of questions, but I kept right on asking. So if training starts tomorrow morning, that's Monday, when's our first jump? Tuesday afternoon, get your hands off the table. We leave Friday night, which means 5 jumps in 4 days. Right, 2 on Friday. Will you concede this shot? Concede your Aunt Minnie, shoot, and if the ones who have never jumped before get through this week alive, are they supposed to be paratroopers? Not by a damn sight. They'll be qualified parachutists. You must keep 1 foot on the floor at all times. Would you be so kind as to keep quiet, sir, while I'm playing, sir? I thought of the 5 back-breaking weeks at Fort Benning and wondered aloud how anyone could be taught even the most basic fundamentals of parachuting in less than a day. Like this next shot I'm about to execute, Leghorn assured me, it can be done. You're standing in the light. We started our training program with the inevitable lecture telling us what was coming. First on the docket was ground training, which called for leaping off platforms, dropping from swings, and rolling on mats, all with an eye to reaching the point where we could make a landing and walk away from it. During this session, an old U.S. airborne battle cry, "Don't forget to tumble," had one of its frequent rebirths. Leghorn was smitten with it, and in a matter of minutes 51 had adopted a new motto. Then came an hour in a parachute harness, swinging, learning what to do between the plane and the ground. Finally, practicing exits. The only thing new to me, the hole wasn't nearly as wide as I thought it should have been, and it got narrower at the bottom, but there still was enough room for a man with a chute on to drop through. The exit sequence started with sitting sideways on the edge, knees drawn up, one hand grasping the edge behind you, the other back of your heels. On action stations, swing your feet into the hole and sit as far out on the edge as you could get. On go, give a slight push off with both hands. Straighten your legs, throw back your head, grasp the insides of your trousers, and drop on through. Conking your head on the opposite side of the hole was known as ringing the bell. Shoving off too hard was almost certain to make you a ringer, and leaning your head forward to look down, the most natural instinct at that point, was absolutely guaranteed to do it. Leghorn, who kept insisting, "It's damn well nigh impossible to crack your noggins if you do as we tell you," looked relieved when we each had completed 5 exits through the mock-up fuselage with no bloody noses or split foreheads. When I asked him about several partially obscured dents near the bottom of the hole, he smiled, flaked off a bit of paint, and identified the gouges as teeth marks. "We usually have to touch it up after each class. Someone forgets and looks down. I'd appreciate your not mentioning it to the others, though. Bad psychology, you know." The air brake was next on the schedule. A regulation-sized hole had been cut in the second-floor porch. On either side of the hole were iron sawhorse braces standing about 4 feet high and supporting a small cable drum. The pipe which went through the middle of the drum had 4 metal fans attached to one end, each fan a 10-inch square. One end of the cable was fastened to the drum, the other secured to a parachute harness. Sergeant instructor slipped into the harness and demonstrated the air brake. He sat beside the hole, followed the command sequence, and made his exit. The metal fans slowed the drum as it whirred around, and he landed on the mat 20 feet below as though he'd stepped off a chair. Then the cable was rewound, the harness hauled back up, and the students were given a crack at the brake. After we'd each had a couple of trips, Leghorn called off the proceedings. "That's all for today, chaps. You've done quite well. We'll run through exits and landings again in the morning, and if the weather holds good, we'll jump in the afternoon." Again, I spent the evening being demolished in the billiard room. Between impossible shots, Leghorn discussed the theory behind the training methods used at 51. "It's simply a matter of using psychology because we don't have time to do anything else. There is no alternative. How long were you in training at Benning before your first jump?" 3 weeks, counting A stage. That was physical conditioning. We have 1 day to get students ready for their first jump. 1 day, mind you, and 5 days at the most to turn out the finished product. There's no time to teach fine points. There's certainly no time for physical conditioning. Psychology, that's the answer. Finished product in 5 days. It's a wonder some of your products aren't finished in the strictest sense of the word. There's one other cornerstone in our system. In 9/10 of the cases, a student who comes here must be taught enough to make just one operational jump. His airborne career will last only long enough to get him in behind the lines. It's a case of teaching the absolute basics, then getting his mind to the point where he has complete confidence in his ability to make what you Americans persist in calling the money jump successfully. Well, if it's a con man they need here, they struck pure gold when they dragged you out of one of those tanks. I wish you luck, and it might come in handy. These boys I'm with didn't wind up in the OSS because of low IQs. If they figure out what's going on around here by tomorrow afternoon, they'll be as steady as something that's just been led from a burning stable. In which case, I'll count on you to set a shining example. You can count on me for giving you a shot in the head with this cue if you don't stop shaking the table. Tuesday morning was lovely, and Leghorn ruined more than one appetite at breakfast by cheerfully announcing we'd jump right after lunch. Our first instructional period was exits and landings, then a seminar on how a British chute opens or develops. I stifled a yawn and wondered if I still knew how to sleep with my eyes open, one of the few real accomplishments of my college career. Then it dawned on me that their way and the method at Fort Benning were exact opposites, so I sat up and paid attention. American parachutes came out of their packs after the riser and suspension lines, then cracked open suddenly. The terrific jerk this gave the jumper in mid-air was known as opening shock. The British packed their chute so the silk canopy came out first, opened gradually, and pulled the lines and risers out, all with no stunning jolt. It was a bit slower, but infinitely smoother and more pleasant. After the development demonstration, Leghorn said he'd skip any further instruction. Instead, we'd go over and watch some of the morning jumps being made at Tatton Park by the regular airborne students from Ridgeway. After all, he said, you lads have learned all you need to know. Wouldn't want to get stale. This was after less than 10 hours of somewhat casual instruction. He noticed my look of amazement and asked, "Any comments, Lieutenant Hall?" "Only one. You must have lost some close relatives at Bunker Hill." We arrived at Tatton Park a few moments before the first plane came over. It was an ancient Whitley bomber, ideal for training purposes because of its slow speed. After the pilot throttled down almost to the point of stalling, the first man dropped out. As his chute opened gradually, he swung back underneath it as a pendulum. I was impressed by the absence of anything resembling the vicious shock which characterized all the jumps at Fort Benning, and by the fine display of form. Leghorn paid tribute to that by remarking, "Must have been an instructor." The next student's exit resembled nothing so much as a would-be suicide who changed his mind too late. Head over heels, arms flailing, legs kicking, to make it a complete atrocity as the canopy filled out, the jumper's legs became entangled in lines, and he started his descent hanging upside down. A loudspeaker started blaring instructions, and the student shootist managed to free himself and straighten things out in a matter of seconds. I nudged the chief instructor. "Better call the roll." "Why?" "Somebody must have wandered off and gotten in the wrong line. That last exhibition, he had to be one of ours. I mean yours." Leghorn, whose psychology treatment had suffered a noticeable setback, kept us at Tatton Park until we'd seen enough proper exits to restore our shaken faith in his oft-repeated assurances. The landings were uniformly and fortunately excellent. No student mind seemed troubled on that score. Not troubled, but certainly preoccupied. As our bus pulled up in front of 51, a large Siamese cat, which belonged to one of the cooks, strolled out the front door to greet us. Someone who was considered normal asked, "What's that?" "A Siamese cat." "Where's the other one?" After lunch, as we straggled into the hangar at Ringway, one of the school sergeants confirmed something I had suspected all along. I was to jump first. We drew our chutes, and as I walked over to the dressing racks, I had a vague idea something was missing. After I'd adjusted my harness, climbed into it, and gotten all buckled up, I suddenly realized what was lacking. A reserve chute. Once again, Benning and Ringway were at odds, and in this instance I took violent exception to the British scheme of things. When Leghorn came over and asked me to help him harness up some of the other students, I balked for a moment on the grounds it would make me an accessory, then gave him a hand. Some of my classmates were beginning to turn a delicate shade of green at the thought of things to come, and I found myself matching Leghorn, psychologically speaking, phrase for phrase. My most effective morale booster was, "Look, if I can do it, anyone can do it, and I've done it." I still felt naked without a reserve chute, and while Leghorn and I were having a last cigarette together, I spoke briefly but with great feeling on the subject near and dear to me at the moment, namely, would I break His Majesty's government to spring for 2 parachutes? Our chief instructor replied, "I'm not the least bit worried. Why the hell should you be? Chins up, hearts of oak." And heads to match was a homicidal way to save a buck. Our Ringway instructor came over, introduced himself, and said, "Lieutenant Hall, Captain Leghorn has suggested you test jump for the afternoon drops." "Well, that's big of him." "Yes, quite. He said you'd done it at Benning. You know the procedure. Our people on the ground check to make sure the altitude and estimated wind velocity are correct before the student class is jumped. They'll have slide rules out before I stop bouncing." Again, I cornered the redoubtable Leghorn and delivered another harangue. This time the theme was, "If I'm going to work here, I want more money." He was mumbling about Lend-Lease when as number 1 man I climbed into number 1 aircraft F for Freddy. Once we'd gotten underway, my only worry was that Freddy would never get off the ground, much less make it to the drop zone. After a series of shudders and lurches, we were airborne. The 2 jump masters began to move around, hooking people up. One of them leaned over and shouted in my ear, "Test jumping, eh? You must know your business." I wrote the book on it. Talking seemed to help, so I yelled across the hole to the student opposite me, "How do you like the way F for fragile flaps along? I only hope I fall clear when it crumbles. Don't care if this is my first one. I can hardly wait. Takes more nerve to stay in this flying strawberry crate than it will to go out of it." I was wondering if this was more of Leghorn's psychology when the senior jump master crawled past and straddled the hole. He looked at me and grinned. Listening to the intercom for a moment, he shouted, "Running in." I wriggled into position. The red light came on. "Action stations." I swung my legs into the hole, glanced at the tense faces of the students bunched in a line on the opposite side, then looked back at the red light. It flicked off. The jump master, whose eyes never left me since he was taking his cues from the intercom, raised his right hand and I started the push-out. Number 1. The green light blinked on. Go! I dropped through, saw the tail of the plane pass overhead, watched my chute stream out and develop, felt the merest suggestion of a tug on my harness, and heard the loudspeaker cut in. "Good show, you, number 1. As I steered my chute around, I found it lacking in maneuverability of its American counterpart because the risers and suspension lines were much more difficult to reach, but I was too delighted by the total lack of the dreaded opening shot to be in a critical mood. I also made a mental note to apologize to several persons I had refused point blank to believe when they told me that, as often as not, you had to look up at a British chute to be sure it was open. My landing was a piece of cake, but I threw in a spectacular roll for Leghorn's benefit. He came down to see if I was, in fact, finally admitted under considerable pressure that my exit had been a thing of beauty, and after I'd balled up my parachute, we trudged across the field towards the loudspeaker. This test jump was evidently satisfactory because the plane circled back over the drop zone, and the rest of the class came out in slow singles. They all did surprisingly well. As we rode back to 51, I was still shaking my head. 24 hours earlier, these same students wouldn't have been sure of the difference between a parachute and a spinnaker sail. Now they'd made their first and hardest jump in fine style and were well on their way to being qualified parachutists. It added up to a resounding victory for Leghorn's methods, and I told him as much. The rest of the week was charming. We learned something each day, proved it by making the required jumps, became quite attached to the habit of having tea in the late afternoon, and caroused mildly in Arlington during the evenings. One of our number grew quite fond of a lovely young WAAF stationed at Ridgeway, but their romance withered. He couldn't stand the strain after learning she was a parachute packer. The first day's jumps had been singles, then we were taught how to move a 5-man stick to the plane and out the hole. 3 from one side, 2 from the other. This was hilarious during dry runs. It was also extremely tricky when played for keeps. On our second stick jump, I went as last man, number 5. On the way out, the number 3 man froze for a couple of seconds. That was enough to throw number 4 off his timing and make him jittery to boot, so he slowed up too. By the time I got through the hole, the plane had passed the drop zone. That wasn't serious, but it meant I'd have to steer myself back over the field. The worst thing in prospect was a tree landing, which wasn't sought after, but seldom proves tragic. Leghorn was on the mic saying soothing words to numbers 3 and 4, both of whom were still shaky and not handling their chutes properly. As I wrestled mine back towards the zone, a gust of wind hit and carried me straight at the instructors group around the loudspeaker. By this time, I was too far down to do any more steering. I had to get ready for a landing which promised to be what was locally referred to as a smasher. All I could do was loudly inform Leghorn and company, All right, boys, break it up." Leghorn turned as his comrades scattered, saw me swooping down on him, and calmly announced, "And now we present Lieutenant Roger Hall." He held the microphone at arm's length over his head, pointed it at me, and stepped to one side as I swung past, missing him by 2 feet and the mic by half as much. It was my intention to say, "God save the King," but all the audience ever heard was "God." The rest was lost with my breath as I slammed in so hard I shook the ground for yards around. Leghorn's comforting words as he bent over me were, "Jump when you're supposed to, and you'll land where you're supposed to." I still didn't have enough air in me to do justice to the language the occasion called for, but I did manage to rise up weakly and try to hit our chief instructor. The last morning at 51 came up cold and foggy, the Middle England weather getting back to normal after 4 lovely days. My classmates were disconsolate. They had to make 5 jumps to become qualified parachutists, according to U.S. Army regulations, and even though we'd managed to get in 2 jumps on Thursday, they only had 4. Leghorn came striding into breakfast grinning and rubbing his hands. He looked at all the mournful faces. "Cheer up, lads. You'll make your jumps. I've been hoping for a patch of fog now. We can use the balloons." "The what?" "The balloons." He looked straight at me. "This is one time you all start off even. How about it, Roger?" "How about lying down while I call a doctor? You must be losing your mind. This weather is enough to make the postman call up and say he's sick." "Be that as it may, we jump in an hour, so hurry and eat your porridge." I didn't take him seriously until our bus pulled into Tatton Park. Then I saw what he had in mind. We were going to drop through a hole in the bottom of a basket hanging beneath a captive balloon, which was fastened to a winch securely anchored to a huge truck. The fog, which had grounded our planes, wouldn't have the slightest effect on the balloon. No one mentioned the effect that not being able to see the ground might have on the jumpers. Our chutes had been trucked over from Ringway. While I was buckling up, Leghorn came over and said, "I told you we'd jump. I'm a man of my word. Either put on a chute or ease up on that we talk, and stop looking so pleased with yourself just because you found a device certain to destroy the class to a man. Before I go up in that damn thing, I want to file an official complaint." "Go right ahead. Where and to whom?" "Here and to me." "Oh, great. Think of it as a doomed hero's last wish." "My pleasure. Now, what is it?" "Tell the British War Office that this kind of jazz went out of style right after the First World War." The truck came over towing the balloon. The big bag was hauled down. 4 of us and a jump master climbed into the bag, and a command was given. "Send her up 8 and down 1." It was proved to mean up 800 feet and down 100. I asked why we couldn't go up to 700 feet and stay there, but no one answered me. Then things got too quiet for my liking, so we hung over the edges of the basket and raised an ungodly din the rest of the way up. The jump master finally ordered us to sit in the 4 corners and be still. 2 students promptly began discussing in loud whispers the feasibility of chucking him over the side, cutting the cable, and hoping for a favoring wind to blow us back across the Atlantic. The other one, sitting next to me, kept leaning forward, peering out the hole into a solid blanket of gray nothingness, and yelling to nobody in particular, "What are you doing down there, George? Shoveling coal?" By the time we were hooked up and ready, the jump master seemed quite anxious to get us out of his basket. I glanced out the hole, noticed that the unseen truck was evidently moving slowly, thereby keeping the cable at an angle and out of the jumper's way. We lined up for slow singles. I went last. What impressed me the most was the deathly silence. No roar of airplane motors, no whistling wind and creaking metal, no shouts, only a quiet, "Ready, sir, go." I felt for what seemed like a long time, then heard the soft swoosh of the chute canopied out and caught hold. Again it was a gradual with no shock at all. I had to look to be sure. Since there was no forward motion or prop blast, balloon jumpers fell between 150 and 200 feet before their chutes fully developed. The fog made the air heavy, and I figured my speed of descent was comparatively slower. I came out of the thickest part of the gray blanket about 300 feet up, watched the ground for a few seconds, and decided to try for a standing landing. If you misjudged your speed and tried it when coming down too fast, a variety of unpleasant things could happen, ranging from snapped ankles through dislocated knees up to and including a fractured spine. Because of the high accident rate, it was forbidden procedure at both the U.S. and British parachute schools, but it was the airborne equivalent of a hole-in-one, so jumpers kept trying to get away with it. Leghorn must have guessed my intent, because the loudspeaker blared, "None of your tricks, number 4. Don't forget to tumble," which was all I needed. I spread my feet apart, breaking another ironclad airborne landing rule, and hit within 10 yards of the chief instructor. There wasn't much of a jolt. I kept my balance, stayed on my feet. Then before Leghorn could say a reproving word, I took 1 step toward him, fell to my knees, and finally collapsed at his feet. The balloon jump wrapped it up. Late in the afternoon, we were ready for the trip back to London. 51's commanding officer made one of his infrequent appearances, congratulating us for a job well done, and asked Captain Leghorn for a few words, which is just what that worthy gave us. "Gentlemen, thank you for not ruining my reputation in its entirety. During the first part of the train trip, I listened to the tales of heroism and bravery being told by 11 brand new parachutists. Each man described his every jump in complete detail. I fancied myself a hardened veteran and somewhat of this kind of clatter, so I fell asleep. But when we arrived in London, I was first in line at the Red Cross Club to have the blue and white British parachute wings sewed on my right sleeve just under the red and blue Special Forces wings.